some new people. And this is, to me, this is a very important meeting. And I just have been looking forward to this. I'm the executive director of Mind Freedom International. I've been doing this for about 3 years, but I've been doing this kind of work for 30 years. Celia and I have been good friends, colleagues, co-workers, and all the stuff that you can put on that for many years. Celia, take over. The one thing that I would suggest, we're at Mind Freedom really engaged in trying to spread our shield around to protect people's rights. And we have our first one with Roads to Freedom, where we're trying to advocate for a 72-year-old man who has a guardian and has been disappeared in the nursing care system with no contact. So we've been reading about that. If any of you are interested in participating, all the information is on the Mind Freedom website, which is mindfreedom.org. It's very easy to get. And what we're trying to do, along with Judi's room, is to be as inclusive as possible with all people who are interested in rights, people who have been abused or just don't want to see what's happening continue. And the more people we can get together who are dedicated, the better we do. So I'll give it over to you, Celia.
Thank you so much, Ron. I really am so excited to be here and with all of you and our distinguished panelists. I'm so thrilled to be having a conversation with them and for all of you to meet some of them you may not know. So my name is Celia Brown. I'm a psychiatric survivor. I'm an African-American woman, and I'm also the board president of Mind Freedom International, and I'm a founder of Surviving Race, the intersection of injustice, disability, and human rights. So today I'm wearing you can't see it all, but I'm wearing a paisley purple shirt with a jacket. My hair is kind of curly. I have some lip gloss on, and my pronouns is she, her, and hers. This is like going to be such a great conversation, and I just want to make sure I have all the questions together. I want to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to read their bio for Judi's room. So our first panelist is Chaku Mathai. His pronouns are he, him, his. He's an Indian American born in Kuwait who became involved in survivor ex-patient advocacy efforts as a teenager with a psychiatric and addiction history. His personal and family experiences with radicalized trauma led to suicide attempts, drug overdoses, and psychiatric and addiction diagnosis as a youth and young adult. These experiences launched Chaku and his family towards a number of efforts to advocate for alternative supports, equity, and inclusion in the community. So let's welcome Chaku. Emmy Carissa is here, and I'm very excited about her. Is a Southeast Asian user and survivor of psychiatry who grew up and lives in Singapore. She's involved in legislative advocacy at the international and national levels. She's passionate about language, justice, and likes to connect people. Welcome, Emmy. Vesper Moore, they and L. I hope I said L okay. Vesper Moore is a mad liberation activist, trainer, writer, and psychiatric survivor. They have been advocating as part of the MAD movement for several years and have been the recipient of many social justice and diversity awards. Vesper has brought the perspectives of mad people, disabled people, and psychiatric survivors to national and international spaces. They have experience working as a consultant for both the United States government and the United Nations in shaping strategies around trauma, intersectionality, and disability rights. They have been at the forefront of legislative reform to shift the societal paradigm around mental health. Vesper, as a mad queer Indigenous person, has made it their life's mission to rewrite the narrative psychiatry has enforced on our society. So let's welcome Vesper. But last but not at all least is Say Kim. And Say Kim is a proud immigrant and a queer woman of color, is a passionate believer in peer support and holistic approaches to wellness and healing. As a former director of a peer-run respite program, Say experienced firsthand the power of mutually supportive relationships that can liberate and empower people. Say hopes to spread the healing power of authentic connections and to work toward creating a community that affirms and values the humanity of every single person. So let's welcome Say. I don't see, oh, you're there, okay. So our panelists, we've worked together. We had a meeting about Judy's room, and I have a couple of questions that they came up with, which I'm very excited about. So I'd like to start with Chaku. So Chaku, what are some of your experiences that inform your work and priorities today? And I'll ask everybody that, but Chaku.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for including me. It's an honor to be here and get a turn at offering some perspectives about this important work of art, decolonizing not just psychiatry, but also our movement in many ways as well. So I think, the effort has been, for me, in terms of informing it, has been my own experiences as an immigrant coming to the United States and experiencing an incredible amount of xenophobia. When we came as in the 70s, we went to New York City and then went upstate. Upstate where we went to was Rochester, New York, where they were, supposed to be kind of a lot of jobs and Kodak was hiring and things like that. But the reality was no one was hiring people of color. Immigrants were, it was specifically a time where Asians, and specifically South Asians were really being targeted as invading the country and causing problems. And, there's a lot of issues that were happening there. So a lot of the messaging was an energy as well as actual vocalizations of go back to where you came from, as well as physical assaults. I was beaten by young people with baseball bats, assaulted in school. I was, jumped on a regular basis. My guard was up very quickly. And that led to a lot of different issues for me, not feeling safe anywhere, including my own home, mistrusting my family, starting to think they were trying to kill me and poison my food, and mistrusting everyone around me, So getting involved in systems eventually, because my family never called 911. We only ended up in the system because of someone else calling 911, that kind of thing. And then me ending up in the hospital and my family realizing and seeing immediately just the repeat of something that had been happening internationally to us as well. It happened to my cousins in Kuwait and in India, and which is a narrative that said that something was wrong with us, and not really hearing what I was going through. So I'll stop there, because our advocacy kind of went from there to really trying to find alternatives, because everything that was offered to us was really about, meds and doctors and beds and being like and just becoming more like everyone else, as opposed to bringing who I was. So I'll talk more about that from a decolonization perspective later. But now, thank you, Celia, for including me.
Thank you. Vesper, you want to answer the same question? What are some of your experiences that inform your work and priorities today?
Yeah, certainly. Some of my experiences have included really at a young age, growing up with a mother who had a partner who was fleeing a dictatorship in Cuba, right? And growing up in the United States as a first generation American in a lot of contexts, and learning that the way in which our society perceives madness, largely, which is how I describe my experiences, is in such a way that really emerges from a colonial history, and that learning about my own indigenous lineage throughout my life led me to be like, well, the suppression of this seems very similar to the suppression of a lot of aspects of my identity around madness. And that really has been through my journey. I was someone who was incarcerated in several psychiatric institutions for a 4-year span. And I encountered a lot of horrible things along those ways. Quite a few of those institutions are since closed because of some of the horrible things that they had done to people. And as a psychiatric survivor and learning more about this movement, realizing that there are so many Black, Indigenous, and people of color, brown people as well in our communities who are often brought into the mental health industrial complex involuntarily, and then often are told that, well, you need to be privileged to have this type of care, while simultaneously being abused. So through that experience, it really impassions me to do that work as a teenager, and really seeing a lot of those abuses. I was just very driven. At first, I called it mental health advocacy. I came into the movement in a lot of ways, which is through the system and not through community. And today, as we discuss things more and more, I think about anti-racism efforts, really how can we reach more people in the community and not through systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Vesper. Say, I have the same question. What are some of your experiences that inform your work and priorities today?
Thank you, Celia. And I just wanted to quickly thank you and everyone here for allowing me to be part of this. Even just 5-6 years ago, my existence was so much about making myself small, and for the purpose of trying to keep myself safe. So being on a large platform like this and connecting with all of you is such an honor and privilege. And so I'm very grateful. I also want to share that I have a really high fever today. So I'm having a little bit of a hard time staying centered. So I may be off the video a little bit, drinking water and that kind of stuff. So thank you in advance for your patience. To answer your question, similar to Chaku, I think in addition to the childhood trauma that I experienced, there's a lot. I feel that I've experienced a lot of trauma specifically around the immigration system. So I came here to the US as a child as a dependent of my parents. So basically, who were studying here to pursue their higher education. So what that meant for me was that there was really no viable path to citizenship, even though I've been living here for a very long time. So I've spent most of my life living under a lot of uncertainty and fear, stress, lack of stability, and feeling like I had no agency in making any kind of major life decisions, like who I get to have a relationship with or pursuing higher education. So that sense of despair, I guess, combined with the impact of living with trauma, and also feeling like I was constantly living against a ticking clock. Those things contributed to me seeking the more traditional mental health care, and then me experiencing which for me was deeply dehumanizing and re-traumatizing. So when I learned about peer support somehow by accident, I've been feeling so liberated and empowered by it. I feel like I can finally show up as myself. So that has really informed my work and my priorities. And the shame that I used to hold around the fact that I had psychiatric hospitalization. Now it feels weird to think about the fact that I used to be so ashamed of it that like no one except for my sister knew about it, because now I talk about it all the time. So yeah, I'm gonna go on mute for now, but thank you all for
Yeah,
your patience.
yeah,
Great.
it's wonderful. Emmy, are you there? I want to ask you the same question. What are some of your experiences that inform your work and priorities today?
Hello. Oh, okay. So I'm Emmy, and I'm a bit sleepy today. Also, can I ask if this is going to be? I know it's being recorded, but will it be uploaded online?
On what you mean, a platform, you mean?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Ron, I guess you can answer that.
Yeah, it's, I'm not sure what kind of platform uploaded and linked. And it'll be Susan Fitzmaurice, who does I Love You, co-sponsors With Mind Freedom. So I'm not sure of her platform, so to speak, but I'm sure before the meeting's over, we'll put that in the chat and repeat it where you could find the video.
Okay.
Does that answer what you're looking for?
Yes. Okay. Could I ask that we edit out part of what I'm going to say?
Can you what? I'm sorry, Emmy.
It's not very clear what I'm saying. It's just that I might have to self-censor a bit depending on whether or not it's recorded and uploaded.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I'm sorry
Well,
that you have
yeah.
to do that, but I understand.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess that was just a demonstration of what some of the things that inform my work. So I'm from Singapore, which is this tiny country in Southeast Asia, which is at the tip of Malaysia and close to Indonesia. And it's an authoritarian one-party state where we have been ruled by the same party for about 60 years now, with a parliamentary supermajority, if not total control of parliament, and where people don't always know how to distinguish between government and country. And we have a lot of problems with freedom of expression. And people are punished for even just sharing Facebook posts. So it is not very, it is kind of scary. But so a lot of, I think, but that really also informs my approach to activism, because I find that authoritarianism in the political sense, it's also quite reminiscent of psychiatry. I would say that our country's approach towards its citizens is a bit like that of psychiatrist to patient. Well, generally it just treats the citizens like children, and the government tells us that they are doing things that we don't like, but it's for our own good. So and it gets a way of saying that. But anyway, so I also, I think as someone from Singapore, firstly, I where in Singapore, like it tends to be where like Chinese people are oppressing brown people. So for me, I like to problematize the concept of Asia, and also because the Singapore government has historically used this false concept of Asian values to oppress people as well. So this has been something that I really like to problematized. At the same time, I also want to recognize that as someone whose family comes from what is now today Indonesia, where Chinese people are persecuted. It's complicated because I think the persecution of Chinese people in Indonesia is more like the persecution of Jewish people in Europe. And I remember growing up and my mom telling us that Chinese people in Southeast Asia are the Jewish people of the East. So then I was always very interested in meeting Jewish people and talking to them. And also and then language justice. I think it's very important because it's someone who can't speak either of her ancestral languages. So I can speak two colonial languages, two imperial languages, English and Mandarin, but I can't speak any of my parents' home languages. So there's a lot of language loss. I can't really speak Mandarin very well either. So that's something why I realized that language is so important. I've also worked with the deaf community and really advocated for sign language interpretation. And that's something else that I also do on the international level, especially since I've gone for conferences where people really they rely on my very bad Mandarin to translate for them, which is just not good. So okay, finally I will say that I don't really identify as a person of color because I really don't experience it. Like there's something called Chinese privilege in Singapore, which I can talk about more later, but yeah.
Okay, Emmy, thank you so much. Before we go on, any of the panelists want to say anything else before we go on or comment on what's already been said between you? No?
I'll just say I've been grateful to see that, you know, we have this conversation from a decolonization perspective across Indigenous, Asian communities. It's a very you know, I guess I should neglected conversation, but I think it has so many parallel lessons to learn for all of us. I think if we look at it from that lens, it'll really help us address the issues that relate to anti-racism, not just in the United States, but really internationally in every country. So, Emmy, thank you, Say and Vesper.
So let's get into that now, because the title of this is Decolonization, which I've been practicing all day, and anti-racist approach. What do we mean by decolonize? What do we mean by that? And what are the implications for our survivor movement?
Yeah. So I'll just take a turn and get out of the way real quick. Eh? And then, you know, because I think the complication for me, I like to make sure I talk about colonization and neo-colonialism, now you got me saying it wrong, eh? The idea of the current ways in which, while many countries have been independent from colonialism, oppression continues through various forms, right? So even using Indian stories as an example, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, these were stories that were written in order to oppress in some ways. So they were oral traditions that had liberation embedded within them. A number of us would have that as part of our indigenous ways of storytelling, yet the ways they were written and told ended up putting men in power, ended up creating caste, ended up, you know, putting royalty in power. You know, there's a lot of different ways in which colonization and colonialism occur, you know. So psychiatry and oppression and movements, all of these different aspects are reflections of that process. So one very simple example is just, as Vesper started to talk about, you know, not only coming into a system, but then being given services that actually were co-opted and appropriated from my own culture, you know, like mindfulness and yoga and things like that. Like, wait a second, you're now not only pathologizing me, but you're also giving me the same supports that we brought to you in the first place. You know, like, I don't know, it became very apparent that was something that was it was really just oversimplified into, oh, you're just needing to deal with the stigma of mental health and dealing and not wanting to admit that you need some help. That's not at all what we were concerned about. So anyways, I'll stop.
Thank you for clearing that up. I know people might have wanted to know what that meant. Vesper, they will go to you. What are your thoughts on decolonization? I can say better than de. Isn't that weird?
Well, I think what's getting folks is that there's colonialism, right? And then you're trying to deconstruct the effects of colonialism on a society, countries, and as they exist in different microcosms, right? So like you end up going like, but it's like decolonization because there's the colonizing aspect of colonial culture. So then you want to say decolonial, and then and kind of go back.
I'll get it together.
But I can say that that's truly at the root of it. I really appreciate what Chaku had to say. The use of mindfulness as a tool for social control is something that's very prevalent, especially if you are someone who is labeled the non-compliant patient, right? That you can just practice these mindfulness practices, right? That were actually used to achieve, right? Some certain degree of self-reflection and enlightenment. But instead are being utilized to suppress you and your identity and oppress you in many different ways. And I think that that's a very good example of utilization of other cultures as a tool for social control that we see in therapy and psychiatry, and what I like to refer to as the mental health industrial complex, because there's many facets here, right? In the pharmaceutical industries and private industry, you have psychiatry, the profession, you have therapy and the practices of therapy. And then you have people within those professions that maybe they are allies, but that largely this industrial complex is so far out of control that it's serving as something that is incarcerating us both in these institutions, and in community, and enforcing carceral behavior. And what I mean by that is a culture of punishment. So when we talk about decolonization, I also encourage you to think about how are we dismantling a culture of punishment from a form of authority that isn't led by the community, right? So when we talk about introducing this movement, right, the psychiatric survivor, the MAD movement internationally, to different folks, that it shouldn't be introduced from this mental health industrial complex. Will it always inevitably, as long as it exists? Yes, but I think it should exist more and more through community and more through grassroots initiatives.
Yeah. Let me just ask you, do you think, I mean, when I got in the movement, I seen a community at that time. So, because I was struggling myself, knowing that something was different than the mental health system I was in, like, I felt like it had to be something, I just felt very, very stuck and not able to be who I am, any of it. But so when I stumbled onto the movement, like some of you have already said as well. So I met Judi Chamberlain, and I went to a conference. I think that they did the wrong thing by sending me in Troy, New York. It was called Self-Help Vision. And Ed Knight was there, Chaku and Joe Rogers. And I was like, I was just so surprised. And I said to Judi, who's allowing you to do these alternatives? Because that's when they were doing alternatives to the mental health system. She said, no one, we're just doing it because we're empowered to do it. And that changed my whole life. I want to ask this, well, I'll ask it in a minute. I want to stay on this topic, but I'll ask that for the next question. So, Say, do you have any words for what Chaku and Vesper were talking about? Did you want to comment? I know she's not feeling well, but you don't have to. I just want to,
Were you addressing me, Celia? I'm so sorry.
Oh, we were talking about, well, Vesper and Chaku were talking about colonization and why don't you say, Vesper, what you were talking about, Chaku?
And decolonization in our society.
Yeah. You is that enough, say, or you want Vesper and Chaco to say a little more?
Yeah, sure. Let me offer a couple recent experiences that I had. So for whatever reason, I was looking up the amount of bombs that were dropped in Korea during Korean War recently. And it really struck me for the first time in my life that these reports I titled as experiences of American heroes, and the aftermath, the utter destruction of a country, lives lost, the infrastructure, and the Korean folks having to build all over again from scratch, and the continuing impact of the US military in Korea. And then, people thinking, and how, I thought about my own grandparents living in abject poverty, and then that leading to my parents thinking that maybe they need to get higher education from America so that they have better chances in life. And then when we come to the US, it's our experience is almost like isolated. So the context of how that happened usually gets lost. So if I voice any concerns about any of these things, I get told, well, if it's so bad, why don't you go back to where you come from?
Yeah.
And then another thing that I've been talking a lot about with different folks is this concept of Han, which is like a sense of despair, anger, and sadness that runs through all the Korean people. And that comes from like 5,000 years of history of, getting invaded by various countries, the Korean War, families being torn apart in North and South. And I really identify with that. I find power in it. It speaks to me, but I think about how easy it is to pathologize it, especially if you look at it from the Western lens. So to me, the importance of decolonizing mental health is looking at the bigger picture and really thinking about how we've come to be where we are now, because we can't really move forward without accountability. We can't really talk about unity or doing better unless there is this explicit recognition and accountability. So that's what I wanted to add really quickly. And I may have to turn up my video and step away every now and then. I'm really sorry for that.
Thank you, Say. Emmy, your thoughts?
Hello. Okay. So there was so much that everyone has been sharing that's so powerful. And I also hope I'm not saying anything that's so very harmful to East Asian Americans, because I really don't necessarily have a lot of context. So say if I say anything, or Chaku, if I say anything, please let me know. Because the context here is kind of different.
I think
but
you'll be fine. I mean, yeah, you understand how this works. Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, so I guess well, in terms of colonization, I think it is something that has to be addressed all across the world, like Chagu was saying, and I'm not from South Asia, but also I know that, like, for example, in Malaysia and in Singapore, Indigenous peoples have been really oppressed by post-colonial governments. So, for example, they turned an indigenous settlement, a pre-colonial indigenous settlement, into a landfill. There was hardly any protests. And then in Singapore, we are told that Singapore has no indigenous people, and many people don't know there are indigenous people in Singapore, and many of them had to seek refuge in our neighboring country if they wanted to continue with their traditional way of life. And also in Malaysia, it's like with them in the US and North America, there's the boarding schools, in Australia as well. In Malaysia, they send indigenous kids to boarding schools, and they are barbed wire fences, and they're taught to hate themselves, and they try to convert them. It is not good. I also know that in India, and Chaku would know about this, in the Northeast, and in the indigenous peoples in central India as well, they're very marginalized. They are made to take tea, and then after that it's all packaged. And then after it's sold back to them at exorbitant prices, which is like colonialism all over again. And also, I guess also in terms of how I relate to the US, when we were doing our preparatory meeting, it was quite interesting because I was asked, like, don't I feel like I've been, Singapore has been really affected by US warmongering and colonization. So at first I was like, oh, what? Is Singapore that affected? But then I went back and thought more about what other people had asked me, and I realized that while in Singapore it might not be so serious, it's not like Korea and like not like India with regards to the British, the colonization was not that to that degree of harm. But we do have some sort of, often people feel like the US does things better, or when my father went to Japan to do his degree, it was considered not to be as good as a UK or US degree. And therefore that caused a lot of harm, intergenerational trauma, because then my father was really unhappy. He felt really, and this is like a post-colonial government thinking this. And then also my family, because of the violence they experienced in Indonesia, the Suharto government, which is the dictatorship, was supported by the American government, and which persecuted Chinese people. We were not allowed to celebrate our festivals or use Chinese characters in public. We had to change our names, and for a long time, even the word Chinese in Indonesian was considered to be our offensive word. Couldn't even say it. It's like the word Jew, I suppose. So
Emmy, this is like, I could see how much pain this brings you, and even discussing this, and all of you. And I'm wondering, how do we get this out? Like, everything you're talking about, I think, can bridge some of these gaps, can be educate people about what colonization and in mental health. How do we get this out into the world, into the survivor movement, into our communities? How do you think that we do that? Chaku, do you want to, can you give
I'll
us some thoughts?
start
Yeah.
off. Well, I mean, we have to at some point have this conversation around, well, what does this have to do with, and how does our movement reflect on this, and what do we do, right? So because we are very much either participating in it or working towards dismantling, as Vesper pointed out earlier. So what does that mean for us? Well, part of it is recognizing because you can't say every country is going to do it the same way and has to. There's got to be some common ways across movements, though, across our movement, that we recognize. One is, for example, to recognize the incredible heterogeneity of our experiences, right? So we've got, in Asian Americans or communities alone have an incredible diverse. I'm sure this is the first time I've actually been on a panel with, multiple Asian members of representing different Asian communities and indigenous communities, right? So I also am part of an indigenous culture of India. We're the South Indians and indigenous mundas. So that process of being not just colonized by the British, but by Indians, by Aryans coming down and actually taking over our communities. These experiences have a consciousness in our movement that is trauma informed. I mean, so Laura was on, for example, earlier. I was so grateful, bringing this idea of a historical, intergenerational trauma, rights-based understanding to our international movement means that we see that this stuff is in our bodies, right? This is not going away just by intellectually understanding you know, whether racial inequities exist or not, right? It's got to be something deeper than that. So our movement actually has some promise to do something about that. Being intersectional has some promise to doing something about that. The fact that we recognize when co-optation and colonization is occurring, even in our own practices by psychiatry and other systems, that's an advantage. These are all strengths of our movement. I say we just need to build on that further and recognize when we are also being racist, when we are also being colonizing, you know, when we are, you know, and part of that is when someone calls it out, to be able to hear it. And to be able to recognize it. And so, and, you know, having more of these sessions is one of it, having more of us in leadership. David Oakes and Judi asked me to be part of their board process with the founding of the World Network of Users of Psychiatry. I asked, why are you asking me? They said, we have to be very frank with you. We have no people of color on this board, and we need to be very explicit about that. Are you willing to, and I was always having to be the first. It sucked.
Yeah.
And it felt very tokenizing in order to be the first.
Yeah.
But at times, that's part of what our dilemma is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with the expansion movement. We always first ones in the room, probably because somebody was trying to fill a seat. But the reality was we had to do something with that. That's what Pamina Yellowbird kept saying to me, you know, like, what are you doing with that moment in there when you get that privilege to be at there? Don't just complain about the marginalization you're experiencing. What are you doing with the power and privilege that you get when you show up at that conference?
Right.
I got there, right? So anyway, I'll stop there. That's my first set of statements.
Well, I wanted to add, you know, when I was talking about the self-help vision and meeting Judi Chamberlain and everything, I had that at that time needed an alternative to madness, you know, until these medical diagnoses that I really couldn't identify with. So for me, it was good to meet people that were doing consciousness raising, who were thinking like I would want to think. And I think maybe what got lost, and some of them are my best friends. Ron is a good friend, and a lot of people on this call are good friends. What I want to ask you is what happened? Because what I have been told by some people in the movement, well, we're all going through a similar thing. We're in recovery, or we're in lived experience, or we've been in forced treatment, and we've been forced shock. So, you know, we're all going through similar things. When culture or race comes in, that kind of was a little bit tricky. And some people really said, well, we have nothing against your culture. You know, this is just our beliefs in terms of force treatment. I mean, what do you say about that now? You know, how can that change? Or in just your thoughts about what I just was talking about. Vesper, did you want to mention? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just say, like, in historical context, our movement tried so hard to be like, okay, we're gonna, like, you know, we're suffering so many abuses from psychiatry, and we need to build our own services, and we need to have alternatives to these systems, while we're simultaneously trying to dismantle these systems of harm, right, and work towards psychiatric abolition. And what ended up happening there was, yes, we successfully built these services within the mental health industrial complex, but there are, you know, Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color outside of that complex who are only engaging, right, involuntarily and being incarcerated, and then coming out and be like, I'm never going back to that. I'm going to stay away from that as far as possible. And they, you know, that almost peer support and the idea of these community-led efforts that would normally be a connection to the movement and a connection to these communities and ideals were primarily available to white people. And then, you know, when there were few to call to the table, like Chaku was talking about, you know, it ended up feeling tokenizing because there's only so few. And then trying to spread that message and be like, hey, like, do you want to speak against this system of abuse? And it's like, well, I grew up in a household where we don't even acknowledge this. And then when I did go for help, I was abused. You know, it makes it unappealing. And then there's the nuances, right, of how many diagnoses have been centered around race, how many times, the violent person of color has been put in the psychiatric institution and has been told that it's their fault and has been disabled as a result of it, right? Or just the very fact that madness as it exists, which is something that is contrary to colonial convention, in every context in our society is oppressed, and it's missed in different social justice movements. Often when people talk about mental health, they're talking about it in a carceral sense, once again, that is oppressing all of us. Yeah, so when I think about recovery and a lot of those ideals you're speaking to, Celia, I think that's what happened. I think, we built some of those alternatives, and the alternatives were largely more accessible to white people because of white supremacy.
Yeah.
Sam has had his hand up for some time and wants to say something.
Well, he can't speak yet because Ron, are we ending at 7:15? And I see you again, Sam, but I would like us to have our conversation first. Yeah. So,
Am I loud?
no,
Sam, not yet.
okay, we're not going to speak right now, Sam. I'm sorry, but I will call on you after our conversation. So, Chaku or Say, did you want to respond to that, or Emmy, of what Vesper said? It was really well said. Oh, you don't have to, but
Well, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I know there's a lot of people here who have a lot of great expertise and perspective to offer as well. So I'm grateful for that. I'm looking forward to that. So thanks for giving us some time to unpack our own thoughts here on this. I think it becomes an issue when we have to start prioritizing. Yvonne made a comment in the chat, for example, about anti-Black racism, for example. So the reality is that Indians struggled with my choices to purport anti-Black racism as the priority in my community of Rochester, New York, for example.
yes,
right?
and I'd like you to talk.
And I got a lot of pushback and anger and frustration from people because I wasn't focusing on Indian mental health and focusing on decreasing stigma of Indian mental health and all these other, getting more Indians into treatment and all this other stuff.
Right.
Listen, that's not what we need to do.
Yeah.
We're not the ones getting forced into care in great numbers. It's the Black and Spanish-speaking communities in our areas that are increasingly forced into treatment. If you show me an Indian that's forced into treatment, fine. I will address that, but that's not at the policy level where this is occurring, So when I did that, that really pissed off funders, that pissed off people who, my former mentors or, that kind of thing, right? But the reality was that's what we had to do. We had to start making some tough choices about what we were going to prioritize. Are we going to have a criminal justice priority as Vesper recognized in that process, or are we going to make sure every narrative only matches an ex-patient, traditional ex-patient narrative that was about hospitalization when I first started, for example, alone. That was a language issue, a narrative issue, and an inclusion issue. But new policy priorities would occur if you're going to include Black, Indigenous people of color.
Right. Let me ask you, did you want to talk a little bit about your advocacy work with Daniel Pruce in Rochester, New York? You did a lot of.
Let me do that now. Yeah, well, whenever. I mean,
well, we don't have to do it now, but
yeah,
I don't
we can get to
forget.
that in a little bit. Yeah, but I'll definitely give an update if that's what you mean.
Okay. Say, did you have anything to add to Vesper and Chaco, what they're talking about?
My brain's all over the place. I apologize. But one thing that Chaku, you said really stuck with me is that our body carries these pains. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about too, especially members of minoritized communities who are trying to make changes within the movement. Like, it often feels like we have to choose between preserving ourselves and focusing our energy and efforts where it is truly appreciated versus taking a crack at dismantling the bigger system, which feels like an almost impossible task. So it's a constant negotiation within myself. So I've been thinking a lot about things that I can do on a personal level and in my immediate community in addition to forcing myself to be brave enough to show up in these places and talk and share my stories and demand the changes that we would like to see, while making sure that I am taking care of myself too. So that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, that I imagine resonates with a lot of other BIPOC folks too.
Thank you, Say. Emmy, did you want to say a couple of minutes on this, and then I want to go? I know you like to go on, and you say great stuff, but I have to keep time.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
So I guess from an international perspective, because I have been engaging more in the, like, let's say in Asian Pacific advocacy, when I do sometimes, I mean, I have more opportunity to. So sometimes I feel like there's this sort of like, which is not very helpful, but it's a sort of dichotomization, or sometimes there's this whole huge dichotomization of global North and global South, which there is a lot of issues that need to be addressed from the global South that I am sure that I don't completely understand, because I come from a relatively from a well-to-do country, although its welfare system like the US is not good, but there sometimes it's also about differences between within countries, inequality between even countries. I remember someone said that, like, being a Black person in the US is like the global South and the global North, and also, people talk a lot about like how there's not so much psychiatry in the global South, but then it also depends on caste, class, like whether or not someone, even like, for example, in India, upper class people do get trapped by psychiatry, even if someone from, who are not from the upper caste, or, indigenous peoples, or people from rural areas, they don't get trapped by psychiatry. But there is this issue. There just needs to be more specificity. Also, I think from what people can do is, in terms of international solidarity, is that sometimes the sort of rhetorics that ethno-nation states, post-colonial ethno-nation states can use about like, we are Asian, therefore we don't accept these other ideas, is that also to interrogate what this means. Is this really a sort of a cultural thing, or is it something that governments has used to weaponization of culture?
Luisito. I need my chair.
Okay. Thank you. So I want to ask Vesper a question. In your work as a mad Indigenous activist, how do you believe Indigenous rights and mad justice intersect?
I feel like for me, they intersect in a lot of ways, and the main ways is that we need to really focus on identity freedom as a movement when we talk about madness and the ideas of mad pride. And I'd be amiss to say, since we're in Judi's room, that I wouldn't speak to mad pride, that we focused a lot on psychiatric abolition, and fantastic. Please, we need to keep that momentum up, but we also need to focus on mad pride and the validation of madness as a valid human identity. And the reason why I say this and how that ties into Indigenous rights is because that we as human beings have a human experience, right, of whether it be human, hearing voices, experiencing emotional distress in different ways. That is a process, right, for ourselves. And often historically in many Indigenous societies, we have had elders who can guide us through those experiences of hearing voices and sharing those experiences. And we've actually like adapted that, peer support, which is a naturally occurring thing. And we brought that to these large systemic behemoths. And we've been like, okay, this is actually an Indigenous practice, right? We're having elders who are guiding, in a way, people through these distressing experiences. Now, what I'm saying is that we can continue to utilize that ideology, right? And that we're not only discriminated on the base of having a disability in quotes, but rather we are being discriminated on the basis of our identity, and that it is valid, and that there's so much that is being dismissed from us. And if we actually embrace that and celebrate it beyond, protesting against it, which we need simultaneously, once again, If we can actually have policy and law developed that's like, okay, this person, this person who identifies as a mad person, by diagnosing them and labeling them as mentally ill, you are discriminating against them.
Yes.
And that is how, you know, it ties in, because we're talking about identity on the basis of how it naturally occurs in community and learning from each other.
Right. That's a very good point. Anyone want to contribute to what Vesper just said?
Well, it's right on. I mean, I think the way we've made meaning out of our experiences and the control over how that's characterized is exactly what Vesper said. If we were finally able to, you know, have a chance, and I'm a voice here, I'm part of Hearing Voices Network, for example, and that's great that I've been able to find a community and be part of a community that welcomes me in this way. Yet our struggle has really been what Vesper just said, which is to extend that further into having people really challenge the ways in which they've pathologized those experiences. And if something's challenging, of course, something's challenging, but we have other ways in which we can talk about that as opposed to the way we are now. So there's a lot to talk about there. I mean, that's just that's I think that's a strength of our movement, I guess, is what I'm hearing Vesper say is let's not lose that. Let's lean into that and really make that a priority message. That's what a great point. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, you all are brilliant. Okay, what would be your strategies that might make a difference for the survivor expiation movement to build an anti-racist, anti-oppression framework? And I know we've already been discussing it, but I just wanted to specifically ask that question. Any thoughts? Chaco, did you want to take that on?
Well, I mean, so we just said a couple, you know, so one was, you know, really identify and if we're talking about an international movement, that right there, taking back our mad pride and reframing and really taking that on as the message of our movement. Wow, that would be amazing. I think that is a decolonizing message. That's very that rings very well to me. It hits caste, it hits racism, it hits all of these aspects or reflections of that kind of oppression. The second piece is the intersectionality in the message, which is to recognize all of the different ways in which those intersections of oppression and marginalization exist, and the cumulative effects of that, and how the various aspects of power and privilege also reflect and relate, that we all carry different varying levels of each, right? Depending on the various identities that we're pushing forward at that given time. As a man, for example, cisgendered male, I'm always going to have a tremendous amount of power and privilege that I have to be conscious about and recognize how that affects not just my choices, but other people's choices about to include me, and whether, you know, so the ways in which I get selected for things versus other people, things like that, right? That kind of consciousness is something we could start raising, and then being more explicit about this, so that we're not just having some null curriculum, but that every conference we do, everything always expresses these points very clearly, so that it's a priority. That's it. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Anyone, Emmy, did you want to comment briefly?
Yes. Okay.
I'm sorry, hon, I just want to, you know, you're saying great things.
Oh, no, I know. I wanted to say that one thing that's really important, I think, is to ensure language justice and language access. In in the US, I guess, and then also in international movements, because I noticed that in advocacy, there's a huge, dominance of people who speak English, and this doesn't necessarily map. It's kind of related to colonialism and not necessarily mapped onto global North, global South. So former British colonies, people from former British colonies who are upper caste tend to be able to participate in global activism more.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so inspired by this whole conversation, and I, as an activist, I want to say, well, what can we do now? So we've talked about this, but maybe this is the beginning of a conversation that can continue to happen before we do anything, as I'm always action oriented. But I'm really so humbled and learning so much from all of you. Is Ron there? Where's Ron?
Yeah,
Can I
Celia,
add one more thought about it, Celia, before? Just one, remember we talked about the trauma orientation and that we already have. Just we can start creating healing spaces of our own in a way that is much more powerful than we've even touched at this point. We can acknowledge what Say and I were acknowledging about the healing in our bodies and build up the kind of healing approaches that are already happening in ancestral communities and knowledge, so there's community healing networks, there's all these practices, there's, so anyway, that's all I just want to say.
But I think we need to, maybe the five of us can work on this at some point. I'm not saying tomorrow, next day, but I think we need to be conscious enough, because this is very important. It's happening. I'm seeing it more happen on a global level of our identity and colonization. And I just have been to Ghana, basically, and I see it so much, and it bothers me so much. So I just think that we need to do a healing practice network, or on whatever you want to call it. And I'll help initiate it, because I know we're all busy, but I just think it's very important. And I worry about my son and my niece and nephews, or who's in this world now. They don't have a lot of elders now because their grandparents aren't here. So I'm kind of in that role, and my mom as an elder, which I never thought I would be an elder yet. Like I had elders, and I just go to them and talk with them, but they're not here now. So I'm rethinking that. It makes me kind of sad, but it also, I have to also step up to the plate, but also get support and being an elder, being, in our movement and just in the community. It's not always easy. And I'm trying to learn from my dad and my aunt and people that were feared in my family, as they are the elders. And I'm trying to remember and speaking to them, because I talk to them as my ancestors, like, what do I do here? What can I do? And you have to listen to really get an understanding of what's going on, and comes in so many different ways. I could hear a voice, or someone could come to me and say, "Hey, Celia," and I'm like, "Oh, wait, that's coming from my Aunt Gloria," or something like that,
And briefly, if I may,
Go ahead.
this is the right time right now to start doing this work, as more and more people are identifying and experiencing emotional distress for the first time, and are understanding what the mental health system is in a lot of contexts. And I think globally, it varies depending where you are in the world. I mean, Emmy, the other day I saw you on a panel to the public, or not the public, but the execution or the attempted execution of a disabled man who spent 10 years in prison. And it was just like, here I am, I'm sipping my coffee, in this capitalist westernized, society I have a lot of privilege in, and here are my people on another part of the world, being incarcerated and being up for execution in such horrible ways.
Ron, thank you, Vesper. Ron, did you want to?
Yeah, Celia, generally we get a lot of input. I hope the panelists can stay. And there are a lot of people who have written in the chat and have something to say. So I'd like,
well, you
guys are open to it, to open it up. And one thing that I would like, if you would address the question I have, how does an organization like Mind Freedom or other ones that are predominantly white, we do have a little bit of diversity, but how do we make people feel welcome so that we can expand this? We've been trying to do that with people who have the typical disabilities that are recognized, so I think I just spoke to somebody today who was involved in the movement in 1974 when it was NAPA in San Francisco. And he said the biggest problem they had, I didn't agree with him, but we talked, was the lefties, because the lefties wanted it to be egalitarian for everybody. So there was no leadership. It just, nobody could take a lead. So it just didn't work. There have to be leaders, but there have to be leaders who are listened to and who do the listening. So I just hope that gets addressed, how we can do this.
Yeah.
There's a couple of, Sam had his hand up for a long time, Celia, so.
Yeah, okay, so what, I want to sort of end with another question, and then we could just have a conversation, if that's okay.
Yeah, and also understand that we'll stay here.
Okay.
So that people can have an opportunity to speak.
Can I
So,
say something? 3 sentences.
okay,
Yeah, so one thing you can do is to send people of color, especially in Asia, send Asians to speak because they might be taken more seriously.
okay. Thanks,
Interestingly.
Sammy. So here's another, and then we can continue the discussion, but I just want to get this in. So what are some practical tips and strategies, really building on what Ron said, that folks can implement to center equity in their workplace or organization? So Vesper, I don't see Chaku. I know he's something. So anyway, Vesper, did you want to?
Vesper can go though, yeah.
Oh, okay. Vesper, did you want to address that? All of you can, and then we'll open it up to everybody.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating when we talk about equity when we haven't yet achieved it, right? We really need to, meet people where they are. But from like a policy or organizational level, if you have a nonprofit that is organizing or is doing some wonderful work in the community, and there's some things that you want to do in this regard, I mean, I would look at your board of directors. First and foremost, if you have a board of directors, what representation is there? Are the policies in place say that someone can, discriminate against someone, or that they or that they cannot by any means discriminate against someone? There's often leniency in policy, which is to lend flexibility to harm in a racist context and in many contexts. And that is often for the organization to defend itself, which comes from this inherent fear of productivity, which comes from capitalism, which comes from white supremacy, it comes from a lot of things, right? But I would say reformat all those policies. Think about representation on your team, who is supporting who, and have intentional conversations that take an anti-racist stance. Not just a racial equity stance, but actively interrupting racism as it exists. If you hear something comes up, hold someone accountable, have a discussion, call them in as well, call them out if need be, but be willing to have dialogues with each other that can actually work through and speak to racism and how we internalize it and how white supremacy affects all of us.
Thank you, Vesper. Chaco, did you want to respond?
Well, it's another big, long conversation. So yeah. So I think all the things Vesper said are right on. I mean, I'll just speak from experience with a few things. I'm the president of a statewide advocacy organization that started out all white. I was on the board as one of the few people of color, but they just couldn't keep it moving that way. And then now that as I took on the role of president, I made it a recruitment priority and just made sure that I was reaching out to communities, had the credibility with people. Now it's a 50% people of color board as opposed to a 0% people of color board as it was before. And it's actually on, about to become 75% BIPOC, right? So reflective of that priority. And I also hired a CEO of color, the first priority there as well. That push is a variety of different issues that I think, you know, we can keep talking about. But
Yeah.
thank you, Ron, for the question. I think there's a lot to do there.
You know, one thing I don't want to lose sight of, if people want to do this again, I invite you to do part 2.
We do. Thank you. Next year, right, Ron? I guess we'll come up with a
Yeah.
date.
Yeah.
Yes. Great, thanks. So I just want to go around and ask people before we break into conversation and questions with everyone who's here. Is there anything you want you know, people to know before we end? And that'll be your last word. So we'll start with Chaku. We'll start with you.
Oh, wow. That's a tough question to ask. Well,
Is it?
you know, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you know me, one of the priorities for me is that there's always a stage in which, you know, after people have oppressed us and dismissed us and ridiculed us or removed us or all of the things that happen when you're trying to bring about change in society, A.T. Ariadna kind of has this quote. He said that then comes the most dangerous stage. And that's when they give you respect.
Yeah.
And so for me, what that means is that there's always going to be a point at which I can recreate the qualities that outraged me in the first place. I can become the oppressor. I'm just as likely to do. So how am I going? The complicated relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor is something we have to be willing, and the complicated relationship between our oppression and our liberation. I mean, how do we reflect on that in a way that allows us to truly be free?
Wow, that's so deep. I can't even write it down, but this is recorded, so I'll hear it from you, Chaco. That's great. I'm going to go to Say, because I know Say's not feeling well. Say, did you want anything you want to share? Last words.
Yeah, I wanted to share like a few practical things that I think would be really helpful on like an organizational or professional level. So like really thinking about equity when creating a budget or making any kind of like programming decision, especially if that program is supposed to serve a minoritized community, making sure that they are at the table from the get-go so that they are the ones leading the discussions. But even beyond that, I think we should all strive to move beyond the idea of providing culturally sensitive or culturally relevant services. It's great to have folks at the table, but why don't we redirect resources so that folks can create their own tables and create communities and support systems that truly work for them and that resonate with them. And I also wanted to briefly mention that workforce development, I think, is also extremely important in terms of supporting BIPOC communities and folks. So like when you supervise BIPOC communities, also providing them with like the leadership skills and support in that specific area so that they can continue to become the leaders and then have, you know, increased representation, have their voices heard so that we can course correct and continue to move forward. And as part of supervision in an organization, making learning one of the priorities so that it is just part of the job, and then also adequately compensating people for doing that kind of self-learning, and then also dedicating resources for community outreach and relationship building. That's based on trust. So Chaku, you're the one who told me about the importance of showing up to events and really being there without the expectation of the communities doing something for you in return. So building that relationship first and strengthening it. And also, excuse me, making sure that if we are inviting minoritized communities to teach us anything, making sure that we are compensating them for their efforts and time. Thank you.
Thank you, Say. We're going to go to Emmy and then Vesper, last but not least. Emmy, anything? Yeah, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am here. So I want to say that in relation to what Say just said about paying people, compensating people for translation, interpretation is not charity. It's important to have good interpretation. So when budgeting, it is important to budget that in, because I know that there have been times where, you know, people have been asking, like for a global meeting, like they will say, oh, this meeting is only taking place in English. And then they will ask me to go and find people. And then they'll be like, why are there so many people from Africa and South Asia? Where are the people from Latin America, East Asia, Southeast Asia? I'm just like, well, you're not offering interpretation, so how can you expect people to attend? The other thing also I wanted to mention is something that really strikes me in international activism is communication styles. So there's this issue of, I think it's a lot of misunderstanding, because I think international people don't know about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture in the US. So we are always told that US people are very direct and that's their way of doing things. And so sometimes when US people are direct to us, we just feel like, oh, it's US people. And that's related to a lot of shame that people feel about how the US is better. And then their reaction to that, when people don't react well to people then being indirect, is that, oh, the US person is thinking that we are inferior. Our way of doing things is not good enough. But I also understand recently from listening to people of color in the US and Black people in the US that is the reason why they might react in this way is that they have been oppressed by white people who are then saying that you can't be direct. And so there's like a two-way misunderstanding here. And yeah, so that's, and I also wanted to maybe something way of thinking, one of the things that we were talking about when we were preparing this meeting was what terms to use. And we were thinking like, should we use diversity and inclusion? And we said that that was too depoliticized. So I know one of my friends, minority friends, she said like, you know, instead of saying like inclusive, we should like with disabled people, we should say like less exclusionary. So we actively think about how not to discriminate. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emmy. And Vesper.
Absolutely. I think I'd want to start off really briefly with kind of what Emmy's saying when it comes to international organizing and the US. I can say from my own experience that we do come from a place where we say things that are very matter of fact, and sometimes we're not always considering the impact on other countries. For example, one of my experiences with the United Nations through a consult, I spoke just after, you know, a woman who was fleeing abuse in Syria via her wheelchair and going across desert and speaking to her experience. And, you know, I realized that although I'm an Indigenous person who lives in the United States, who's multiply marginalized in a lot of contexts, that there were systemic things in place that I could not possibly understand from where I am. But I can be as responsive to through my own suffering, through my own understanding. So I want you to encourage to try to be responsive through your own suffering, through your own understanding, through the beauty of your experience. And I also want to say that our movement is fragmented in a lot of contexts and that we need to come together. First off, we need to not separate ourselves from disability justice and a disability justice standpoint so much. The principles of disability justice really represent a lot of the ideals that we take on as a MAD movement. And I understand that a lot of this comes from needing to embody the ideas of anti-psychiatry, which I'm right there with you. But Bonnie Burstow herself, for example, would say that psychiatry had a king-like power that could take on any person, regardless of what power they had in the world, right? A psychiatrist could incarcerate you, right? And I encourage to really think of that perspective of, oh, wow, it's similar to a disability justice perspective where all bodies and minds are impacted by the mental health industrial complex, regardless of where you are and regardless of who you are. And that simultaneously, as we work towards abolition and we talk about an anti-oppression stance, which we need to have, that we celebrate madness and we embrace mad pride and madness on the basis of identity. I encourage a mad disability justice stance. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. So now we're going to get